Abusi Asante Mewura na kasa no moma yentie no Asante amamre efe mentie no.
For now, please join me in welcoming His Royal Majesty Otumfour Osei Tutu
Let me begin by thanking the St. Andrews Africa Summit and Master the University for the kind invitation to deliver this distinguished keynote address for this year's edition of St. Andrews Africa Summit. The last time I delivered such an address at the University of Cambridge, it coincided with the university overtaking its traditional Oxford rivals for the first spot in the university rankings. I am happy to note that this time round, the University of St. Andrews had broken the duopoly of the Oxbridge colleagues and leapfrogged them to take first spot in the rankings. Well done to the Vice Chancellor and the University for following your success continuing. Your Africa Summit initiative underscores your commitment to the continued study of Africa, both academically and as a challenge to the evolution of human development. The continent presents a study of immense importance to our generation. Only a few days ago, the African Union, representing the 57 independent states of the continent, was admitted into the G20, which, whether this was an exercise in window dressing or a significant step in the process of global development, only time will tell. But at least, the move underscores the point that Africa can no longer be taken for granted. The imperatives of global peace and harmony require rethink both within the continent and in the larger global community about our place in the global family. We face the incontrovertible fact that Africa has been badly served by past history. Our history has been distorted, and we have served periods when even our very humanity has been challenged, even crucified on the cross of Hegelian intellectual. Our generation now has the obligation not to whine and complain, but to stand up and challenge the distortions of the past. We hope great institutions like St. Andrews, through a forum such as this summit, will be part of the quest for the requisite positivity, rationality, and integrity in the study of African affairs that will be conducive to the emergence of a new climate of harmony. It is the reason I'm here, to share our thoughts on traditional leadership in the modern democratic society. The last century was arguably the defining century of the continent of Africa. The preceding century had been, for me at least, the century of humiliation, when the entire continent was carved up in an orgy of colonialism described as the scramble for Africa. The first half of the last century was an extension of the preceding one, with all but in control. The second half of the century, however, saw the dramatic change in the circumstance with the political emancipation of the whole continent from colonial subjugation. It will seem obvious, therefore, in considering the modern African democratic society, that the starting point would be the post-emancipation era, approximating to a little over the last half century. Unfortunately, I fear that will only paint a hazy picture of traditional leadership in Africa. For a fuller picture, we need to leap back in time to be able to feel and appreciate the evolution of traditional leadership across the continent through different epochs. We should examine a snapshot of traditional leadership in the epoch before the European invasion and consequential colonization. Then look at the role of traditional leadership during the epoch of colonial rule to provide the context within which one can fully appreciate the role of traditional leadership in our modern democratic society. It has become the burden of our generation to challenge the historic injustice meted out to our continent through the inhuman characterization of its inhabitants, our forefathers, as some subhuman species who needed to be dragged into civilization. As a corollary to this endeavor, attempts have been made to decapsulate the continent by pretending that the nations of the north, such as Egypt, are not of Africa at all. Such is the prejudice and the hate that since the power of Egyptian civilization cannot be denied, they must construct the subterfuge that no such civilization could come out of the so-called Dark Continent, and therefore Egypt cannot be Africa, be of Africa. And yet, whether you believe in or deny the existence of God, you cannot deny the existence of Africa as one continuous continent. Its landmass stretching from the Mediterranean north to the Atlantic south and from the east to the west. In such a vast landmass, there is bound to be, like all other continents, great diversity in outlook among its population. And yet, overlaying such differences are the multiplicity of languages, is a commonality of cultural organization and compelling evidence of the existence of African civilization in every part of the continent. Assuming there can be no denial of the reality of the civilization of Egypt and ancient Carthage in the north of Africa, we will move to the south of the continent, where the promoters of apartheid had sought to eliminate every grain of African humanity. The impact of the Boer War nor the horrors of apartheid have succeeded in obliterating the magnificent organization of the Zulu Kingdom, or the kingdoms of the Swazi. They were before the European invasion, and they are to this day models of traditional African statehood. Move on to the heart of the continent, the territories of Central Africa. Here lies the Congo, possibly the greatest victim of colonial savagery, still suffering the travails of a tortuous evolution. It was in April 1885 that the Belgian Parliament granted authority to their king, Leopold II, to assume the position of head of state of the new African possession of the Congo. He was not to be simply head of state, but the Parliament stipulated that affairs of Congo would rest exclusively with the person of the sovereign. In other words, the property of King Leopold, and he proceeded to manage it as such until 1908, when it was formally annexed by the Belgian state as its colony. How did the Congo end up in that predicament? Was it because the people were subhuman with no history and no descendable past? In the 50s of the last century, as the flame of African nationalism burnt bright and the demand for emancipation of the continent reached its apogee, the Belgian government published some magnificent volumes of books designed to sanitize their rule in the Belgian Congo. Between accounts of the horrors inflicted by other European powers that preceded them, the first volume of the massive book published by the Information and Public Relations Office of the Belgian Congo and Rwanda ruling also attempted to assuage the hurt of the people by relaying some unpalatable truths about their history. After recounting what had been discovered about the origins of humanity in the soil of Africa, the book noted that much of Central Africa had been shrouded in mystery as a result of the absence of any written accounts of lasting monuments. The inevitable question was posed: must we conclude from this that for nearly 2,000 years, Central Africa, cut off from European progress by the desert and by impassable rivers, saw only unorganized hordes similar to the human heads of prehistoric times? And the authors provided the answer: not at all. There's an erroneous idea. It is still believed in certain circles where people repeat glibly that until the arrival of the Europeans in the last century, the history of Black Africa is one with prehistoric times. And the book goes on. As a matter of fact, the first Europeans who landed in Africa often found communities that were politically organized. Some of them, under the stimulus of the head of a family, who transformed themselves into a monarch, have even become kingdoms such as the Kingdom of the Congo near the mouth of the river, founded in the 13th century, or the Empire of Luanda on the frontier of Katanga, created in the 13th century. There are many evidences of these Congolese monarchies. The very first explorers from Portugal pointed out that the natives there were more civilized, and although they had not yet acquired writing skills as had the empires of Benin and Timbuktu in West, The political structures closely resembled the feudal organization of Europe in the Middle Ages. In fact, the king had divided the country into provinces and districts, at the head of which he had placed delegates chosen by himself. However, in certain cases, there were already popular elections, a kind of democratic counterweight in embryo opposing authoritarianism. There were rather highly developed techniques. The casting of iron and copper was known. Also, the art of pottery and the weaving of clothes so strong that the Portuguese used it as sails for their boats. Certain animals were raised: pigs, sheep, goats, and also poultry. Moreover, long before the arrival of the Europeans, millet, sorghum, banana, peas, squashes, and yams were grown. Such was the Congo, the official Belgian government publication tells us, when their king, Nzinga Ntimo, received the delegate that the King of Portugal sent to him in 1484. Testament to his sagacity, King Nzinga Ntimo immediately dispatched emissaries of his own to the King of Portugal, asking for masons, carpenters, agricultural laborers, and missionaries. In short, all the technicians he needed to help him improve the living conditions of his people. This exchange resulted in the establishment of a strong ties between the kingdoms of Portugal and the Congo, based at the start, not on conquest or vassalization, but on an alliance. The two kings, on an equal footing of formality, exchanged ambassadors, and these diplomatic relations continued for many years. King Nzinga Ntimo was succeeded on his death by his son Otumfour, who continued with his father's quest for the development of the lives of his people. He opened the country to more Europeans and had his son sent to Rome to receive ecclesiastical training, becoming the first African bishop in 1518. Otumfour established diplomatic relations with the Netherlands, Brazil, and the Holy See, and between 1504 and 1539, he sent 3 emissaries to Rome, insisting on being accorded the same privileges as accorded the King of Portugal. Obviously, his assertiveness was displeasing to the Portuguese, but of greater consequence, King Afonso was indignant about the vices which Portugal had introduced into his country. The Portuguese had introduced alcoholism, extortion, and slave trade on a scale which was destroying the moral fiber of his people. An indignant King Afonso threatened to cut off commercial relations with Portugal if they did not stop. It began a period of turmoil in relations between the two countries, leading to an open warfare against the King Don Antonio and the crushing of the Congolese in the Battle of Impila in 1665. From that time on, the decline of the Kingdom of Congo was swift, crushed by military might, abandoned by commerce which had shifted to Angola, and weakened by the slave traffic. The Congo was reduced to vassalization, and as a phantom state, it was finally dismembered definitely in 1885 when it was partitioned among France, Portugal, and Portugal and King Leopold. The official Belgian publication lamented that the privileges extended by the original alliance between the two states have soon been corrupted, giving way to trickery and violence. And the alliance was transformed into such a vast system of exploitation that in 300 years it succeeded in converting into a gigantic slave market this country which might have known a better fate. The Kingdom of Congo was not the only one in the Central African Basin. The same Belgian Congo book also recounts the story of the Kingdom of Bakabu as perhaps the most ancient of the Congolese kingdoms, certainly the one where African civilization has reached its highest point, and the only one which, frozen in a kind of proud conservatism, had remained at its ancient aspect down to the present day. The Bakuba are said to have settled in their present abode as early as the 6th century. Their history is not so much that of conquest as of the development of an original civilization which organized a social system and sought out its own aesthetics. We are told that a taste for beauty is one of the dominant traits of the Bakuba people. Everything in this country is decorated, chiseled, custom boxes, carved, drums, walls of houses. So much for Central Africa, as narrated, not by some African radical, but under the authority of the Belgian Vice Governor General of Belgian Congo. What do we see in the East? As far back as the 11th century, the Kingdom of Mapungwe was trading with Arab merchants on the coast of the Indian Ocean. The Kingdom of Mapungwe, 1450 to 1760, had overthrown the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, circa 1220 to 1450, and was itself defeated by the Osei Empire, which succeeded in expelling the Portuguese colonies from the Zimbabwe Peninsula. In 1838, however, a powerful army of the Shona clan, led by a celebrated Zulu general, Mzilikazi, defeated the largest Shona-speaking empire, taking advantage of the heightened internal rivalries. British descended on the territory, managed to gain the signature of King Lopungo on a document purportedly granting him concession to mineral rights in the territory. From this flimsy foundation, which will hardly survive any legal scrutiny today, began the chain of events leading to the naming of the territory as Rhodesia and to its eventual annexation as a British colony. Away from Rhodesia, in today's beautiful Uganda, we have the powerful Kingdom of Buganda, founded in 1818 and to this day in total control of its affairs within the Republic of Uganda. Need I tell you about the glory of the Empire of Abyssinia, the glorious Ethiopian Empire, which is the only African empire to have successfully fought off European subjugation. Emperor Haile Selassie may have been overthrown by his own military in our time, but his heroism will forever glitter in the history of our great continent. And so to my own backyard in West Africa. The three most powerful kingdoms of ancient Africa were the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Shonga, all rising in the land stretching from present-day Mauritania, taking in Mali, Guinea, parts of Senegal, down to parts of present-day Ghana. Ancient Ghana began in the 1st century at a time when Europe was in the wilderness by establishing the lucrative trans-Saharan trade route between West Coast and the Mediterranean seas. For 400 years, it maintained a state which, by any measure, was on a par with any European state. Internal squabbles led to the collapse of the Ghana Empire, but the predecessor empire, the Mali Empire, built on the legacy of the Ghana Empire and succeeded in creating what was to be one of the richest states on the globe. In Timbuktu, they built one of the greatest centers of Islamic scholarship and learning, teaching all the sciences, mathematics, astrology, and astronomy, creating one of the great universities in Islamic studies with a library of more than 350,000 books and manuscripts. By the sheer efficiency of organization and management, Mali became one of the richest states of the time, and its most famous king, Mansa Kanka Musa, was regarded not only as the richest man of his time, but is considered by many experts today as the richest man of all time. When Mansa Musa made his pilgrimage to Mecca, the convoy of caravans he sent laden with gold almost sent the Arabian economies into a spin. The power of African traditional rule did not die with the ancient empires in West Africa. Near our time, we've had the kingdoms of Benin, Ile-Ife, and Oyo, and the Hausa Empire of northern Nigeria. And we've had the Mosi and, of course, the Asante Kingdom. Each of these kingdoms, the empires, have evolved through ingenuity of their people, creating institutions of governance and organization appropriate and in many ways ahead of their time. To the extent that human civilization grows from the interplay of forces, there's nothing to doubt the capacity of these kingdoms and empires to grow organically from continued contacts with other civilizations without the trickery and treachery of colonialism. So what became of Africa? As all the continent fell under the yoke of colonialism in the 18th century. As I see it, the colonial endeavor manifested itself through two characteristics. What I will characterize as the Oriental model, that is the French, Belgian, Dutch model based on the quest for assimilation, and the British model based on indirect rule. The policy of assimilation was premised on the proposition that the African was of a lower order of humanity and needed to be helped to rise or assimilate into a higher order, which was the European. It was the offering of the status of a semi-skimmed prototype, a shade above the African but still not good enough to be the full European article. Nothing expressed this absurdity better than the Belgian attempt to abolish Congolese nationality. Recounting controversies about Congolese nationality following the annexation into the Belgian colony, the official Belgian Congo book we have already cited confidently asserted in the 1950s. It is, and I quote, "It is the unanimous opinion that Congolese nationality no longer exists." Then, having regard to the existing legal documents referencing Congolese nationality, it felt duty-bound to explain further. It is not a question of a nationality, but of a special status. Since the Belgian constitution provides that the Congo can be governed according to special laws, it can be said that the Congolese are Belgians enjoying a special status. In other words, what distinguishes the Belgian living in the mother country from the Congolese is that the latter are Belgians with a Congolese status. As follows. The native population is ruled according to the extent of its evolution, either by the written statutes or by a native statute. The degree of evolution that permits the native to be placed under the written statute is officially recognized in the course of a special procedure. Every Congolese has the right to according to the civil code. If he can show by his training and his way of living that he has reached a state of civilization that proves him fit to enjoy the rights and fulfill the duties stipulated in the written legislation. The French may have been less obnoxious and certainly better at managing the process of assimilation, but faced with the countervailing force of African intellectuals like Leopold Senghor, Aimé Césaire, Albert Camus, determined to assert their own identity, the assimilation enterprise had little hope of sustainability. It thus had to be the British model of indirect rule that is of relevance here. British colonial policy acknowledged the primacy of a traditional governance, and while they did not endow them with the scope of development, they were nonetheless co-opted into the process of governance in a very practical sense. Chiefs became part of the legislature. Some served in the executive council, which will be the cabinet of today. But more significantly, the traditional structure of governance under the direct rule of the chief remained undisturbed at the local level, leaving the colonial civil servants to concentrate on law and order, taxes, and the provision of such social services as education and healthcare as colonial rule would allow. This collaboration between the traditional rulers and the colonial administration served their purpose well, and when, for example, the Gold Coast was cited as a model colony, it was not because Britain had sent any special breed of colonial administrators. It was because the traditional structure on which the colonial authorities were riding had proven to be that much efficient and effective. But if it served the colonial order well, it will unwittingly open fault lines in the substructure of the edifice of the independent states of the future. For few of the nascent political leaders of the liberation movement fully appreciated the dynamics of the situation their traditional rulers had to navigate. Conversely, the traditional leaders could not by themselves fathom how the relationship between them and their once loyal subjects would change in the emerging political environment. As I have argued elsewhere, it left a trust deficit in relations between our chiefs and our nascent political leaders, which had a negative impact on the constitutional arrangements by which the countries regained political independence. For example, The British managed to accord special protection for the Kingdom of Buganda in the Constitution of the Independence of Uganda in obvious gratitude of the critical support the colonial administration received from the kingdom. But it left a deep political scar in relation with Prime Minister Milton Obote, who eventually tried to abolish the kingdom. Thankfully, the kingdom was restored and remains in full flow today. The political dynamics in Ghana preferred a different outcome. Efforts to give traditional authorities a sustainable status in the independent constitutional order failed largely because, as history often tells us, we do not always appreciate the danger until we are in the grip of the elements. In Nigeria too, while the North managed to integrate traditional leadership at the time, the southern states were less obliging. It remains my view that the trust deficit created by the colonial circumstance in turn created the fault lines which gave rise to the instability of the post-independence constitutional order. We have in the past few minutes undertaken a journey into time, into the glory, seeing the fateful encroachment of European colonization and the eventual subjugation of the continent. And we have arrived at this point where Africa has regained her political freedom. Now, we are required to examine how traditional leadership has adapted to the new democratic societies of our time. Frankly, one would have thought from the epic journey we have undertaken that the issue we are dealing with could be framed differently, namely how far we have gone or how successful we have been in ensuring that the new democratic ideals we have imbibed are firmly rooted in the African soil. That to me is the elephant in the room, or if I may, for Ghanaian political balance, the umbrella in the rain. In the half century since the political emancipation of the continent, the independent states of Africa have undergone bewildering experiences. Military coups, civilian wars, extreme famine have intertwined to create a far more edifying image for the continent, and it cannot be outrageous to suggest that we are still groping for the correct pathway to the resources. If we are honest, we will have serious doubt about a system which offers little or no scope for consensus building in an environment which demands all hands on deck. A system so focused on the winning and retaining political power that considerations of national interest become subservient to considerations of political party and private pockets. Has it been an act of misplaced political indulgence for us to believe that democracy is one size fits all, or a package for simple straight transplant? It may very well be in my view. I've always had a brilliant surgeon here with me in my team, and if I didn't know, at least he would remind me that there's nothing like a simple transplant. So much has to be done to prepare the body before a transplant. Otherwise, you risk the trauma of organ rejection. As with the body, so it is with the polity. However, you package a system of governance that will only survive in the right environment. Unfortunately, we in Africa have been obliged to succumb to the proposition that merely transplanting a multi-party electoral system is sufficient to guarantee the sustenance of democracy and achieve the development goals of the state. I fear this is a grave error, and I say so not because I do not accept democracy, but because what we see only postulates a caricature of what democracy in its fullest sense should be. We have attested to the history of African civilization and governance going back millennia. We have proven how far Britain utilized and relied on the system of traditional government to ensure the success of its colonial administration. I would have thought that we would have sufficient confidence in what we have built, which has served us over the centuries, to use it as a foundation on which to erect a new governance structure, and to then explore how we infuse the new ideas into them to give us a dynamic system appropriate to our conditions and circumstances. Let us be clear. The French Revolution abolished the monarchy under the banner of liberty and fraternity, but democracy did not abolish the monarchy in Britain and the rest of Europe. Democracy was built on the solid foundations of enduring monarchy, and much of Europe and the rest of the world is the better for it. What makes it impossible to use the traditional institutions of Africa as the foundation for the construction of democratic institutions of new independent states? It has to be a matter of great regret that even after the failures of the initial independent constitutional order, we still surrendered to the arrogant proposition that a true African creation is unworthy. I fear this perpetuates the old colonial absurdity which consigns all African achievements and creations to the rubbish heap. It is significant, it is against this background, that we can now look at the role of traditional leadership in the new democratic state. From what we have learned so far, it should be evident that with few exceptions, the constitutional arrangements of the new African democracy leave traditional leadership at the peripheries of national governance. Within that limited range, much good is often accomplished. Traditional leaders offer useful counsel and advice to elected political leaders and serve as interlocutors between them and the ordinary people. As you all know, 80% of the population of Africa lives in the rural areas. The primary loyalty of this mammoth community continues to be with their chiefs. Inevitably, their leadership is critical in the quest for development and prosperity of any country. Contrary to the misconceptions of the times, the evidence is that wherever traditional leadership is strong, they are able to maintain peace and national cohesion. The issue for contemplation, therefore, must be whether the role of traditional leadership should be limited to the peripheries or whether it lies at this stage in our evolution at the heart of critical decision making. I hasten to add that there is no expression of personal displeasure. In the 24 years of our reign as AsanteHene, we've had to deal with 5 presidents of the Republic. I can only pay tribute to all of them for their exemplary wisdom and their commitment to the common good. They've all accorded us the respect and honor, being open to counsel as circumstances demand. But that is because they have all been decent men, well steeped in the culture and traditions of their people and conversant with the influence of their chiefs. Their respect for tradition, however, does not hide the fact that the system of governance in situ places serious constraints on the role of traditional rulers in the governance of the nation. One would have thought, for instance, that the good offices of the traditional leader could be used more purposefully to facilitate dialogue between contending political actors to encourage consensus building and minimize tension and acrimony in national political discourse. That would immediately create an additional layer of the support mechanism needed to sustain national cohesion and stability. It is an option derived from our tradition which would strengthen the foundations of the democratic state, but which is not available now. We have seen how effectively it works as applied on an ad hoc basis in peace settlements. Is it not worrying that we cannot yet find scope for the application of this healthy traditional mechanism to facilitate the resolution of conflicts that adversely impact the economic development of the nation? I should at this stage deal with what has emerged as a matter of the greatest consequence to the fate of our continent. It is the regrettable phenomenon of the resurgence of military coups in Africa. In the first 2 decades of political emancipation, a spate of military coups rocked the continent and took away the first generation of leaders for the immediate post-independence era. Having gone through the experiences that followed, the continent concluded that its fate lay in the orbit of democratic governance, and so it has been for the past 2 suggests that something has gone seriously wrong. Let me make it categorically clear that regardless of the circumstances, I do not think that military intervention offers a solution at this point in the evolution of our continent. There was a time when circumstances produced the notion that power flew out of the barrel of a gun. Those times are over, and we face completely different circumstances now. The critical problem confronting Africa is the economy. From north to south, east to west, and all the joiners in the center. The burden is the economy. It is how we ensure every citizen and every family has food on the table. It is how we create jobs for our young men and women so they can stay and serve their country. It is how we find resources to provide education and healthcare for our people. It is how we apply the intellectual gifts with which God has richly endowed us to improve the conditions we inherited. It is about how we mobilize the rich cultural resources for the good of our society. The state of our economies impinges on the security of our states. Poverty and unemployment, creating stability, represent both opportunities for discordant voices. And yet, the simple truth of the matter is that there's no quick fix for economic melodies. In particular, it has to be stressed that there's no bullet. It has to be said, therefore, that military intervention is fraught with more dangers than it seeks to solve. It is what I consider a ride on a tiger. Jumping on the back of a tiger is an easy bet. Maneuvering the tiger, and particularly dismounting from the ride, is a risk of the cemetery that is better avoided. Anyone in the military, therefore, will be wise to think before he leaps. As they say, the road to hell is paved with the best of intentions, and however grievous the temptation, and however genuine one's motivation, some precipitate actions may produce the effect of pouring fuel on an already inflamed situation. The problem you create may be worse than what you seek to solve. Having said that, we should also be clear that what is happening is telling us something we dare not ignore. It tells us that we have to do better at managing our economies, to break the cycle of poverty and unemployment and give hope to our able-bodied youth to remain and work for the development of the continent, instead of seeking the least opportunity to escape to greener pastures as well. It tells us that we cannot continue to outsource our problems, and no African leader can sleep happy as long as there's an African boy willing to make the perilous journey of modern-day migration. But it also tells us that something is gone awry with our vaunted democratic experiment that needs urgent fixing. I do not think it signals a rejection of democracy as a system of governance. What I think it is doing is throwing into question the structures we have built within our democratic system. And that, I would suggest, reinforces the questions we have been raising about the constitutional arrangements of the African democratic states. I take issue with the notion that our traditional system of governance are wholly undemocratic, and that political parties can better relate to and represent the interests of the people. Of course, we do not question the need for political parties. In every community, citizens may have different views on social and economic issues, and people should have the right to bond together according to their beliefs, and political parties offer the necessary platform for this. However, the cultural and traditional beliefs of Africans transcend his political beliefs, and therefore, while they may split among political lines, they remain bound together by their traditional beliefs. Unfortunately, we appear to suffer from the misconception that political parties will delink people from their traditional roots, such that their traditional institution could be rendered irrelevant. That has not happened and cannot happen for good reasons. Primarily, no African today is willing to be cut loose from his roots, but secondly, because it is becoming clear that our system of governance is as democratic as any and offer a sounder foundation for the evolution of a new democratic superstructure. Let me just give you an example of my own Asante Kingdom, whose system of governance reflects every Akan state. Contrary to the perception of old, the Akan state was not the feudal state of Europe. Every Akan citizen and family belongs to a clan, and every clan is linked directly to a traditional stool. It's councils. In other words, the traditional council is composed of the direct representatives of all the families within the state. In Asante, we have gone further. We've created stools for communities of residents who are not citizens. Thus, we have the Ando community who have been traditionalized of the Asante Kingdom, the Fanti community, and the Zongo community, all represented in the Kumasi Traditional Council. The closest analogy one can make to our system would be to have representation of, say, the large immigrant communities like the African and West Indian and Asian communities represented in the British Parliament. Deliberations are open and as rigorous and intense as you will find in any state legislature. But underpinning it all is the inviolable respect for traditional ruler, traditional order. All matters of adjudication or conciliation are conducted through an open, fully documented process, and all chiefs in attendance are called to express their conclusions. The beauty of it is that every chief always has his advisors and may consult freely before stating his opinion. As an exercise in democratic practice, I would not yield to anyone on the efficacy and democratic nature of our process. We are able, through our system of adjudication and conciliation and arbitration, a myriad of litigation that would have paralyzed the judicial system. Our queen mothers are resolving domestic issues and leading the way to the empowerment of women at all levels. So the million-dollar question is why it is still impossible to achieve a fusion of our traditional system with the new democratic elements that will give us a strong, sustainable structure. We ask how such a fusion would impact on the gargantuan challenges of economic development. I am sure there are many objective analysts who wonder whether our economies are not beyond the narrow confines of partisan politics to manage. Indeed, there are many who now believe our problems require the pulling together of all available talent and human resources, but regrettably recognize that the realities of party politics make it impossible to achieve. The issue that arises is why traditional leadership cannot provide the platform for greater collaboration in the process of decision-making on critical issues of economic management, which overcomes the sensitivities of partisan politics. Surely, as an African setting, this is not impossible to contemplate. It is the reason I'm not overwhelmed by the enormity of the challenges facing Africa, and the reason I ask the world community not to despair about the condition of our beloved continent. We are the children of immortal Pharaoh, the children of Mansa Musa, the heirs of Otumfour Osei Tutu II, the children of King Chaka Zulu. We are what we are and what we were, and we will be what we are. Not the caricature of some proto-Europeans that history has portrayed us, but proud Africans confident of their destiny. I know where the destiny of Africa lies, where our future lies. Africa should look to its past to find its future. And that future can only be as bright as the African sun. Before some of us begin to run for cover, let me offer one assurance. The future is not clouded in revenge or retribution. It is the future of reconciliation and positivity and cooperation. Remember, my great uncle, King Brempo I, returned from 25 years of heart-rending exile, shaking no doubt, but unbowed, and called for the people of Asante Kingdom to embrace the new reality and join together to build a new state of the Gold Coast, which is now Ghana. That spirit of conciliation has reigned with us to today. So did my dear friend Madiba Nelson Mandela, who walked out of Robben Island after 24 years to hold the hand of friendship to his captors and so heralded the collapse of apartheid. I have no doubt that African spirit of reconciliation will prevail in that future and will shine a new light through the darkness that today threatens to engulf the world in conflict. We need from the world community's understanding and support, genuine support to efforts to overcome the ravages of economic wars. In that setting, we can look forward to a strong, regenerated and developed Africa, enriched with the inspiration of its glorious past, sharing prosperity with the rest of the world in peace and harmony. And Ghana and Britain can look forward to a new era in which confidently celebrate the possibility of our historic ties and consign any of the tales to the tales of forgotten folklore. Thank you, St. Andrews, for the opportunity to share our vision of traditional Africa and Israel.
extend our gratitude to His Majesty, King Otumfour Osei Tutu II, the AsanteHene, for gracing us with his wisdom and inspiring words. We take your words to heart. We look at your example to also reconsider the role of traditional leadership in global governance. We would also like to thank other people